So, so first let's sit back and talk about, kind of my theory of story, how it evolved through the Ultima series, and how that sort of informs what we're doing with Shroud of the Avatar. For those of you who don't, many of you weren't alive back in the early Ultimas, but those of you who at least either gone back to good old games and played them, or a few of you were old enough to have experienced them directly, I'm sure you recognize that Ultimas 1, 2, and 3, and Calabath before that, and the D&D game that's actually in Shroud of the Avatar before that, they didn't have much story, shall we say. And even from a features and content standpoint, they were just sort of the hodgepodge of everything I thought was cool around me in life at the time, going out of high school, going into college. And so almost every aspect of those games was plagiarized by the most recent books or movies that I had seen. If you think about Ultima 2, which was a game about time travel, and that's where the plot maps came into being, and that, of course, was informed by the movie Time Bandits. But since I had to have time travel, and one of those time eras you could go to is the future, you suddenly get into all kinds of stuff inspired by Star Wars. And even Ultima 1, you could travel into space, become a space ace, and fight TIE fighters, and do all these kind of things. So the games included 3D dungeons and 2D outdoors, and 3D space in some cases. I mean, they really were just everything that I thought would be kind of fun to do in a game. And that all changed. How far are we, by the way, for this session?
We have an hour and a half at 5:30.
And and if you look back at that period, Calabath and Ultima 1, I published through a company called California Pacific. They were the publisher of my mentor at the time, a guy named Bill Budge, who was doing a bunch of cool stuff at the time. But that guy was, just to be frank and upfront, he was a drug addict, and threw away all the money he was earning off of all of our games, and just quit paying us one day. So, I was really frankly forced to go pick another publisher. Was pleased to see that even though lots of publishers were interested in publishing Ultima 2, I also at that point wanted my game in a box and have a cloth map and things of this nature, and so most every publisher said no thank you because of the cost of goods associated with manufacturing that, except Sierra, who agreed to do Ultima 2 and and it came out in the box. But then Sierra also quit paying me for not exactly the same reasons, but similar reasons, basically squandering the money. And so a second time I was basically without a publisher. And Ultima 3 became Origin's first product. It was when my brother and I tried to use my brother to help me collect from these deadbeats that had quit paying us, and he tried but was not successful. And finally, after the second time around, he's going like, look, these guys are idiots to be pissing off the people that make them their money in this way. Why don't we just do this together, and I can give you one simple promise, which is when money comes in the door, you get paid first. And we're like, woohoo, that's a way better deal than I've ever had, so let's do it. But the reason why that's important to a discussion about story is that that's the first time I began to see feedback that anybody had about the game. At Calabath, Ultima 1, Ultima 2, if somebody ever wrote in, this is obviously before the internet, but if anybody ever wrote into the company about those games, I never saw it. And so the only way I had any idea whether the games were good, bad, or otherwise was based on their sales. And they were doing pretty well with sales. Each one was selling more and more. But you didn't really know why. You didn't know what aspect of the game were people liking, what aspects of the game were people not liking. And it was very interesting when I started reading the feedback of Ultima 3 to see how everybody was playing. Because at that point I suddenly realized that I had created monsters out of players. In that, because I was putting everything up in the game, you could already, in those early Ultimas, do things like run around the counter of a shop and steal from the shop. And there was a probability you could be seen, and if they were seen, the guards would make it run it. You could run out of town and escape, and woohoo, I stole from the shop. But of course, your end goal of the game was to defeat the evil wizard. But what you were actually doing, so people were, when they write in, and by the way, to this day, and y'all, to the degree you ever write in on the forums, etc., are guilty of this as much as this was true in the old days. This is my critique of y'all, broadly, is that every piece of feedback I've ever gotten, like a letter or something, is usually one paragraph of, hey, I really liked your games. And then, as long as they were willing to write of, let me tell you what you did wrong and how to change your plans for the future. And that is, to this day, universally, when people come and talk to us or write us or anything else, that's still the way it looks. And but for me at that time, it was a shocker, to be hit with this criticism, or at least even the compliments were not what you expected. It would be things like, I played the game and I killed the bad guy, and whatever. That was fun enough. But how I'm really having fun is killing every NPC in the game, and especially killing you. And everyone like, hey, that. And I began to realize people weren't being very virtuous, so to speak. I mean, they didn't articulate it that way. But and I also realized that the bad guys weren't really very bad. The bad guys were sort of waiting there for them to come kill them, and the players were just min-maxing the way to become as powerful as they could in order to kill the bad guy. And so it was a functional thing they were doing, not a personal, spiritual journey in any way, shape, or form they were on. And so that's what really started Ultima 4, which is really where story began in Ultima. So that's where I also said, no more Time Bandits, no more Star Wars, no more Lord of the Rings, no more elves, no more dwarves, no more none of that. All of the standard tropes of other people's worlds disappeared. I invented a whole new world from scratch. I said, I'm still going to let you steal from the shops, but I'm going to pay attention to when you steal from the shops. And so if you've been decorating, where's my thief friend here? There you are. If you've been decorating your place by pilfering Arabella's castle, there's a Jira in as of today to populate that place with lots of guards to stop you. And but the point was that the game went through a very deep character shift. And when I also sat down and said, okay, I'm going to write a game that talks about virtues. Well, what virtues am I going to talk about? And I said, well, I could talk about the 10 Commandments, but I'm going, that didn't really seem right. I could talk about the 7 deadly sins, which makes good horror movies, but again, wasn't exactly what I thought would be appropriate to teach a person to do good in their life. And I thought about it, so I thought, well, I got to go learn a bit about philosophy. And I was a terrible student in school, but I was really good at things like science fair that were independent projects. And so I'm a good researcher, so to speak. And so I sat down and I said, okay, I'm going to go. I got to invent a moral philosophy, or at least research some and find one to be appropriate, which turned into inventing. And I started doing all kinds of comparative religious reading, and happened to be over that period, I became a big fan of Buddhism, for example, just as a concept, as a philosophy. I wouldn't describe myself as a Buddhist literally, and I don't think it would have made good gameplay mechanics. I'm just happen to be a fan. And I went through all the Greek and Roman kind of utopian visions of the future to also say they were interesting, but not really timely for today. I mean, they were products of the point in history they were written. And so I actually came to the end and went, shit, there's nothing out there that I personally believe enough and or think is gamifiable enough that I could use it. So I had to go invent moral philosophy from scratch. And so the way I did that is I sat down and I went to most all the books I'd already been reading, and I said, I'm going to pull out concepts that motivate people to do good or evil deeds. And I'm going to put them on a Post-it note and stick those Post-it notes up on a wall. And I had sort of a dividing line on the wall, and if it was a thing that motivated you, like greed, that's a negative motivator, put it down below the line, Compassion, that's a positive motivator, put it above the line. And then after I put all these things up on the wall, I then began to go, love, compassion, kind of the same thing, let me group those together. And I began to make groupings of these to figure out, if I could see a pattern in it, or a pattern that I could buy into. And I first saw the pattern of truth, love, and courage. And later saw the fact that I could even move that one out to the combinations of truth, love, and courage to come up with the 8 virtues that became the virtues of the Avatar in Ultima 4, which I'm sure you all know: honesty, compassion, valor, justice, sacrifice, honor, spirituality, and humility. And I was pretty pleased with that. And one of the hallmarks of why I was, I had already kind of settled all that, and then I happened to be watching one of my favorite movies, The Wizard of Oz, when I realized that I must have come into something deeply resonant as an absolute truth, when I realized that the Scarecrow was truth, the Tin Man was love, and the Cowardly Lion was obviously courage. And so I realized it's not just me that's thought of this, it's others who have come to these same conclusions over time. And by the way, if you look throughout writing since then, you'll find that those actual 3 manifest throughout time quite commonly which is why I not only think those 3 words are literally in the public domain because they're public domain words, but even as a triad, it's in the public domain. Even though I did do an independent invention of it, I do think it's a metaphor that has shown up through time as a reasonable a reasonable standard. And so that's what started, the stories. As many of you might know, in Ultima 4, the game is about proving yourself to be a person of good virtue. There is no bad guy to defeat. You just literally have to, prove yourself in each of those 8 virtues and the 3 principles. Then when we roll over to Ultima 5, well, Ultima 4 was just, Ultima 4 was the first #1 best-selling game in the series, but it also was pretty black and white. In other words, if most of the NPCs, what they had to say was literally a quote from a dictionary of quotes about virtues. I mean, it was literally that direct. And if somebody told you they were a good person and gave you a good quote, their fortune cookie quote, that really they were a good person, and that was their fortune cookie quote. But after Ultima 4, I'm saying, the real world isn't like that. The real world has people who are claiming to be good people, but in fact I think are really rotten. And this was one of the multiple eras through my life and most of yours too, where games were being really criticized, role-playing games in particular were being heavily criticized, and a lot of people doing this heavy criticism were people like television evangelists. And as I was looking at these television evangelists, I was looking at them being critical of me and my games about virtue, and saying, it's not me that's evil, it's you. And so that's what Ultima 5 sort of became. Ultima 5 became this game where I reversed it, and I said, it's a time where, when somebody tells you, I'm here to help, they may not be. And if somebody's over there stealing a loaf of bread, it might be because they're starving, and you should instead help them get out of their hole, and in fact, it might be a great asset towards the path of virtue. And so the game became much more subtle. And then Ultima 7 became a story, really frankly, about racism, which I think would make a good story again these days. And then Ultima 8 became, sort of a story about fighting fire with fire. Now, if you without regard to your personal perspectives on, Western religions versus and the apparent conflict we currently have with, non-Judeo-Christian religions around the world, there's obviously any probability, any one of us hypothetically could have been born anywhere on Earth, and without regard to what you think, you might find yourself amongst people when 100% of those people have very different thoughts than you do about how to live a good life. And so that's really, to me, what the main undercurrent of Ultima 8 is try to drop you into as deeply an alien or disturbing philosophy as I could place you inside of. And then finally for Ultima 9, it was just sort of to wrap that all up and talk about how I think being more introspective and personal your philosophy ultimately should be, and make your own decisions in life and move on. So that was sort of the story arc, that went in, really starting with 4 through 9. And importantly, one of the physical attributes, the physical things that was happening in Ultima 9, for those of you who remember it, was the world was being physically destroyed. For those of you who might remember, there were these 8 columns that were piercing the land. They were grabbing, they were having an attraction to the moons. The moons were being pulled down out of orbit. Those columns were being pulled through the land masses. And so this beautiful land map of Britannia that had remained steady from Ultimas 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, but the time we got to 9, it was beginning to be distorted pretty radically. And then at the end of Ultima 9, you go away, the columns go away, but you really have no idea what happened to old Britannia. So for New Britannia, on the one hand, we don't want to be very careful not to be a derivative work. So we don't reference any of that history, those places, those people, anything that's direct from that, we're very carefully not to build upon going into the future. However, we are still back in the lands of Lord British. The word Britannia is easy to do, so we're calling it New Britannia. We were already disrupting the physical features of Old Britannia, so we can create a new map from scratch, and that is not antithetical to what has happened. But what you all as avatars and what I as Lord British have lived through could be seen as a continuum. And so we decided to build a history for Shroud of the Avatar that was not incompatible with the history of Old Britannia. And in fact, we had another add to that. We were, for the first 2 years, and off and on once a year ever since, we've actually continued to go back to EA to try to negotiate actually literally tying these together. And so I didn't want to go too far away to make it not possible to formally reintroduce the past to the present. However, I have since given up on that. I think it's a non-starter, but we at least did have that in our thoughts. But in my mind, I think it should be it should be no surprise that if you wish to, you can imagine yourself the bridge between the two places, even though I'm very careful to not describe it that way. So now let's talk about the fall. So our story really begins with the book, The Blade of Midras. And in that book, and by the way, getting a chance to work with Tracy Hickman is phenomenal. What an amazing addition he is to this project. To me, what it reminds me of is previous best storytelling era of Ultimas was when Warren Spector and I were working together. That would be Ultimas 5 and 6 predominantly, but a little bit into 7 and some of the spin-offs like Serpent Isle and Savage Empire, Martian Dreams. And Warren, came into the project early as a great storyteller, as a writer and a story craft person, but weaker on game development at the time. But now he's, these days he's also a great game developer. But during the time we spent together, he could bring to us that great story craft capability. And Tracy now is sort of playing that role with the project. And Tracy is, frankly, even no knock to Warren, but Tracy, is a very successful novelist, shall we say, and deservedly so. So we decided to start the reality of New Britannia with the fall, a time when this world, which had multiple moons, have collided and to a large degree fused and created a debris field that all of you can see still in the skies above. That at the collision of those two, not only did it create the debris field, but a lot of that material has fallen down onto the surface of the planet. And that has created the shard fall zones that you are all familiar with. Those shard falls included, not only normal rock that you guys would see around us normally here, but the floating rocks that I expect most of you have seen by now, the obsidian, that is this strange kryptonite-like mythical mutative rock that has a habit of floating. And if you imagine that you were to live in a previously civilized area that Lord British may have inhabited, and the sky literally begins to fall upon the land, if you pick your favorite meteorite hits the Earth movie, if you're on Earth, we dropped enough city-destroying level bombs from the sky to take out a few major cities and a bunch of farmland. That would be a real challenge to civilization. If you think about, even if your city wasn't hit, if the food supply to your city was hit, people would pretty quickly abandon that city. I mean, and by necessity, everybody would go back out and go farming on their own. You'd move from a modern, lawful society into a relatively lawless free-for-all to try to survive. And similarly, if you were one of the monks that was keeping a lyceum of books about the laws of magic and virtue, but the city was slowly being abandoned, and so people began to loot those sorts of places or burn the books to keep warm. You and that clan of monks might decide to build a wagon train and haul off those valuables and store them in some deep recess somewhere for future generations, versus let them all be destroyed. And so that's really what happens in the first era post-fall that is alluded to in Blade of the Avatar, but not really described. No one yet has really described that in much more detail than I've just done for you. But suffice to say that what then the finish of the setup for Blade of the Avatar is that if you basically knock civilization into the Stone Age to some degree, still have vestiges of those ruins still about, then what would likely begin to rise back up after. Oh, and one more piece I forgot to throw in there was that another thing we're changing between the old days and new days is the fundamental structure of magic. And it used to be from Ultima 1, 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, I would kind of build one upon the next upon the next. And the words of power, the reagents, all those things would evolve. They changed some, but they were an evolutionary cycle. And so this time we've started over. We basically said, when this cataclysm occurred, it's the astrology of the sky that has been part of how and why magic has worked. And so if you change that radically, which just happened, it would make sense that some words wouldn't work anymore, some reagents wouldn't work anymore, we need to pick some new ones. And so that's given us part of the excuse for our new versions of magic and reagents and changes in runic. Has to do with this going back to the Stone Age, having a lot of the mystical aspects associated with astrology has changed, so we've had to invent some new basis to come up with. But as the humanity got back on its feet again, you might imagine there's some warring going on between tribal new land areas with little tribal leaders all arguing about fresh water and fertile lands to plant themselves. And the book, the Sword of Midras, begins with the rise of, or describes the last part of the rise of the Obsidians. And the Obsidians, to me, are the first group of people who figured out what had changed about magic procedure. And right after the fall, anyone who had called themselves a magician previously would have exactly zero skill, because things had shifted. All the things they collected didn't work. All the words they knew didn't work. It basically did not work. Period. It was the Obsidians that first said, no. There's some little sparks of this that still are sort of working in a little sort of way. Maybe we can augment it with new words. Maybe we can augment it with new reagents. Build up new procedures. They also learned that this mystical stone, this obsidian that came down, was also a source of some of this new magical power. Could be utilized in this power. Could be utilized magically in order to do a variety of powerful things, including the reshaping of creatures. And so many of you might already be familiar with places like the Epitaph. What's below? It's called the dungeons, the reshaping dungeons over in the Desolus, below Desolus. It is Epitaph. Okay. Okay. And so the command and control of the Obsidians rose in what is now Desolus. The Blade of the Avatar talks about one of their main generals, a guy named Aaron Bennis, who is basically on a mission of conquest. He literally has the largest forces at his command that Novia has ever seen. He should ultimately be able to conquer Novia until he discovers the Crypt of the Avatar under Midras. And in the Crypt of the Avatar under Midras, he finds a mystical weapon, the sword. And having come in contact with that sword, he basically his eyes are opened to the three principal virtues of truth and love and courage. And so even though before he was really there feeling very, I don't think he would have considered himself evil in any stretch of the imagination. I think, in fact, it reminds me of, it's interesting, I was in Saudi Arabia a few years ago, and I was watching this little documentary film about the rise of the Saud family that are currently the rulers of Saudi Arabia. And there was an interesting perspective that they gave upon their rise to power, which is they would argue, and do argue, that prior to their rise to power, there were lots of these individual tribal groups around the Arabian Peninsula that were constantly at war with each other, that it was very difficult for anyone to advance, and that the Saud family unified Saudi Arabia in a way that is now much more peaceful. And that's probably true. And, someone from the outside might look at that and go like, well, you really conquered them. But it's a reasonable perspective to say, they were all fighting each other, including us anyway. And so good thing somebody at least, straightened it all out. And so in my mind, that's what Aaron Bennis was doing. He really did believe that he was, wiping away pathetic, unworthy, frankly, not impure impure in even a virtue sense regimes in order to unify under people who had a good idea about how to be disciplined, maybe a bit authoritarian, but not evil in his mind. And after coming in contact with the sword, he has this long series of awakenings, these moments where he kind of is now more sensitive to the way other people feel about his coming through and conquering them, and reflects differently upon that. And in the end, we don't actually talk about it in the book, but we allude to the fact that instead of continuing forward to conquer, he turns back to undo what he had set forth.